Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule.
During the day on Monday, Washington time, the airport in Saigon came under persistent rocket as well as artillery fire and was effectively closed. The military situation in the area deteriorated rapidly. The President, therefore, ordered the evacuation of all American personnel remaining in South Vietnam. The evacuation has now been completed. The President commends the personnel of the armed forces who accomplished it, as well as Ambassador Graham Martin and the staff of his mission, who served so well under difficult conditions.
By August of 1974, the United States was a nation adrift. Public trust had been shattered, not just in the presidency, but in the very foundation of its institutions. In that moment, Gerald Ford took the oath. He had not been elected to the presidency. He had not been elected to the vice presidency. He assumed a role at a time when the country was not looking for a visionary, but for a steady hand. Ford humbly accepted the office through a reputation built over decades, one grounded in honesty, hard work, and a Midwestern humility. But the moment he stepped into the Oval Office, the shadows of the past and the pressures of the future converged. From the collapse of Vietnam and the fate of its refugees, to the unprecedented, agonizing decision to pardon a predecessor, every choice would test his character and define his legacy. But these moments did not create the man. His foundation wasn't built in the corridors of Washington. It was shaped much earlier. Gerald Ford was born in Omaha, Nebraska, 1913, to Dorothy Gardner and Leslie King Sr. Named after his birth father as Leslie Lynch King Jr., his earliest years were defined less by his name and more by instability. Just days after his birth, his father's behavior became increasingly violent, driving his mother to make a decision that would reshape his entire life. She left Nebraska with her infant son and began a journey east, first seeking refuge with family, then settling in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Grand Rapids, the city of industrial grit and strong moral code, where the aroma of sawdust and varnish emanating from the furniture factories saturated the cobblestone streets, and the gentle rush of the river provided the ambient soundtrack to the daily routine. Dorothy and her son had found more than a hiding place. They had found a workshop for a new beginning. A city dubbed a good place to live became for them a good place to handcraft a life. She soon met Gerald Ford Sr. at a church social event. He was described as an honest, quiet man of strong moral character. Their marriage brought a stable father figure to Ford's life, a man whose name he would eventually take, and whose steadiness would define the environment in which he was raised. In Grand Rapids, his childhood took on a different rhythm. It was shaped by discipline, routine, and expectation, rather than comfort or privilege. He later recalled a simple household code: to tell the truth, work hard, and come to dinner on time. By adolescence, structure began to translate into leadership. He advanced quickly through the Boy Scouts, earning the rank of Eagle Scout in just 3 years. Ford would describe scouting as an early foundation for the values that guided him: duty, service, and a sense of obligation beyond self. Values that would be tested upon a chance encounter with his birth father. 14 years after that desperate flight from Nebraska, fate staged a quiet confrontation at a lunch counter in Grand Rapids. A stranger walked in, his presence marked by the shine of a new Cadillac he arrived in. He introduced himself as Leslie Lynch King, the wealthy man who had given Ford his life, but refused to pay child support. Over a brief, strained lunch, the two men occupied the same space, but lived in different worlds. King offered $25 and an invitation to Wyoming, a late payment for a debt that couldn't be settled with cash. Ford took the money, but he didn't take the bait. With a quiet resolve that would later become his political trademark, he declined the invitation and walked his father out the door. In that moment, he didn't just escort a man out of the restaurant, he closed the door on the past he would no longer need. Having seen his identity challenged, Ford turned his focus to the things he could command: his effort, his character, and his grit. By high school, he found a true home on the football field, an outlet for his competitive drive, and a proving ground for his leadership. It was a path that led him from the sandlots of Grand Rapids to the roar of 100,000 fans at the Big House in Ann Arbor. By the time he reached the University of Michigan, Gerald Ford carried a foundation shaped by discipline and a quiet sense of responsibility. For most of his life, the university future had seemed untouchable. Nothing had been handed to Ford, and finding his place in Ann Arbor would be no different. To pay his way, he took a job washing dishes at his fraternity house, balancing the grit of manual labor with the demands of the classroom. On the field, Ford joined a football program on the verge of greatness. Playing center, the literal heart of the line, he became a vital component of a team that would soon rise to national prominence. His reliability and natural talent resulted in him winning the Most Valuable Player award. But it was not only athletics that would define his college years. In 1934, an incident involving the football team brought Ford face to face with a moral dilemma that would test his principles and put his own self-interest at odds with them. The team's opponent, Georgia Tech, refused to play against Michigan because of the presence of Willis Ward, Michigan's lone black player. Ford had developed a close friendship with Ward. When faced with the situation, he took a clear position, stating that he would not take the field if Ward were excluded. The situation ultimately resolved without Ford withdrawing, as Ward himself encouraged his teammate to play, telling Ford, "The team's having a bad year. You've got to play Saturday. You owe it to the team." The game went forward, but the moment remained significant. It was the only game Michigan won that year, a statement that reached far past the football field. It offered an early and public glimpse of Ford's loyalty to stand by others in the face of pressure, even when there was a personal cost. A circumstance that cemented him not only to his team, but to the university at large. After completing his undergraduate studies, Ford was presented with the opportunity to continue in football at the professional level with the Green Bay Packers and later the Detroit Lions. He declined both offers, choosing instead to pursue a career in law. Before entering law school, Ford sought a way to bridge his two worlds. He accepted a position at Yale University, serving as a football and boxing coach, using the role to secure a spot in their prestigious law school. He proved to be as disciplined in the library as he was on the field, graduating in the top third of his class. In 1941, he returned home to Grand Rapids, ready to launch a quiet career in private practice with a close friend. But the transition was short-lived. On December 7, 1941, the world changed. The outbreak of World War II shattered Ford's plans for a private legal career, shifting his path once again, moving him from the courtroom to the carrier deck and into the heart of a global conflict. After completing his studies at Yale University, Gerald Ford entered the United States Navy in 1942, shortly after the United States entered the war. He was commissioned as an officer and assigned to the USS Monterey, an aircraft carrier operating in the Pacific Theater. On board the ship, Ford served as a physical training and gunnery officer. His duties centered on maintaining crew readiness, overseeing drills, physical conditioning, and the operational discipline required aboard a wartime carrier. The Monterey took part in major campaigns across the Pacific, including operations in the Marshall Islands, the Mariana Islands, and the Philippines. It was a service defined not by combat command, but by a constant exposure to the demands of naval warfare, precision, endurance, and coordination under pressure. In December 1944, while operating with Task Force 38 in the Philippine Sea, the Monterey encountered Typhoon Cobra, a sudden and violent storm that struck the fleet at sea. As winds intensified, the carrier began to roll heavily. Aircraft broke loose on the flight and hangar decks, turning the ship into a shifting field of steel and fuel under extreme motion. During the storm, Ford was moving between compartments when he was nearly swept overboard. He later recalled catching himself against a railing as the ship dropped beneath him, one misstep away from being lost at sea. Inside the carrier, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Loose aircraft collided with equipment, fuel lines were damaged, and fires broke out as the ship struggled to stabilize in the storm. Crew members moved through the chaos, attempting to secure equipment and maintain control of the vessel under conditions that continued to worsen with each wave. The experience became one of the defining moments of his naval service, not through combat, but for the raw unpredictability of command under crisis conditions. Ford left the Navy in 1946 with the rank of lieutenant commander. He carried that experience of discipline under pressure into civilian life, and soon into a different arena entirely: public service. After returning home from military service, Gerald Ford set a new course, one far removed from the Pacific, but no less consequential. In 1948, he ran for Congress in Grand Rapids, not as a national figure, but as a local attorney challenging an establishment incumbent, Bartell Jonkman, in Michigan's 5th District. It was a long shot. His campaign operated with limited resources, even using a military surplus shed as headquarters. He had very little money and little expectation of victory. So Ford relied on something more simple. He went door to door. He met voters face to face. he made a point to remember the names and faces of those he met on the campaign trail. His political strength coming from consistency in small, personal interactions. And when the votes were counted, he had won. Washington in the post-war years was a place of transition. The Cold War was taking shape, and the divide between isolationism and international engagement was becoming the central question of American politics. Ford entered Congress positioning himself as fiscally conservative, domestically moderate, and firmly internationalist in foreign policy. It was a balance he would maintain throughout his career. In the House, Ford developed a reputation less for ideology and more for consistency in judgment and participation. Over time, that reliability became his political identity. As a reliable supporter of the civil rights during the 1960s, he voted in favor of every major civil rights measure brought before the House, supporting legislation in 1957, 1960, 1964, and 1968, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. At the same time, Ford drew clear lines where he believed practically dictated. As President Lyndon B. Johnson advanced the Great Society, an ambitious effort to expand the federal government's role in American life, Ford grew increasingly cautious. He supported the goals, but questioned the scale, the cost, the speed, the long-term consequences. It was a position that placed him between competing visions of the country's future, supportive of change, but weary of expansion, committed to equality, but cautious about the means used to achieve it. As Cold War tensions expanded, so too did Congress's role in global policy. Ford served on the House Appropriations Committee, where decisions over military spending increasingly intersected with global conflict. Legislative priorities now included military readiness, nuclear deterrence, and foreign aid became recurring priorities. And over time, Vietnam became central to that debate. The tensions there were increasing. A greater conflict seemed inevitable. The dark cloud of war was growing as troop numbers grew, costs rose, and global tensions with communism intensified. And the war moved from distant policy to daily reality. In the House, Gerald Ford remained consistent in support of the effort. Grounded in the policy of containment, he viewed the conflict not as an isolated war, but as a broader global struggle against communism. At first, that position reflected a broad consensus in Washington, but as the war stretched on, the casualty numbers rose, that consensus began to fracture. In the Senate, prominent figures like William Fulbright openly questioned the war's direction. Across the country, protests grew. Public confidence declined. Even within his own party, divisions began to emerge. Ford continued to support funding of the war, while gradually backing efforts to reduce American involvement through negotiation. Under President Richard Nixon, that approach became a policy aimed at transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces, believing that we must achieve peace with honor. Ford was not blind to the changing reality, but neither was he willing to abandon the commitments the United States had already made and the costs already incurred. Ford would eventually be faced with ending the conflict and cleaning up the aftermath politically. By the mid-1960s, Ford's steady presence in Congress had elevated him within the Republican Party. In 1965, he became House Minority Leader. He wasn't known for a strong ideology or powerful speeches. Instead, colleagues saw him as a stabilizing figure in a time of growing political fracture. When the debates over civil rights, poverty, and government itself were becoming central divisions in American politics, Ford's position remained consistent, supportive of civil rights, but cautious about rapid expansion of federal authority. Over more than 2 decades in Congress, that balance defined his political identity. In 1963, a sunny day in Dallas dramatically altered the legislative agenda and the psyche of the nation. The bullets that struck down President John F. Kennedy left a country grieving, searching for truth in the midst of chaos. Looking for a voice that was both serious and beyond reproach, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed Gerald Ford to the Warren Commission. The task was immense: to investigate a tragedy and explain it to a fractured public. With the eyes of the world watching and speculation mounting daily, Ford became a central figure in the search for answers. He reviewed the forensic evidence and sat across figures like Jack Ruby, weighing the darkness of the conspiracy theories against the reality of the facts. Ultimately, he stood by the Commission's conclusion. Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone. For some, the case was closed. For others, it never would be. But Ford, steady and unwavering, defended those findings for the rest of his life. By the time Gerald Ford left Congress, he was not a man defined by ideological extremes. He was defined by endurance, consistency, and a rare trust that bridged political divides. It was this reputation, built quietly over decades, that would ultimately place him at the center of a national crisis that no one could yet imagine. In 1973, the executive branch was thrown into chaos. Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned in disgrace, facing charges of tax evasion and bribery. For the first time in American history, the provisions of the 25th Amendment were put into motion to fill a vacancy in the vice presidency. President Richard Nixon needed more than just a replacement. He needed a nominee who could survive the intense scrutiny of a hostile, skeptical Congress. He turned to the one man in Washington known for having clean hands.
Our distinguished guests and my fellow Americans, I proudly present to you the man whose name I will submit to the Congress of the United States for confirmation as the Vice President of the United States, Congressman Gerald Ford of Michigan.
The timing was ironic. After 25 years in the House, Ford had already told his wife Betty that he intended to retire from politics in 1974. He thought his career was reaching its natural conclusion. Instead, his nomination initiated a forensic audit of his life. The confirmation hearings were exhaustive. Over several weeks, the House and Senate reviewed every corner of Ford's record, questioning him on everything from his past votes to his personal finances. The result was a stunning display of bipartisan faith. He was confirmed by a landslide, 92-3 in the Senate and 387-35 in the House. On December 6, 1973, Ford was sworn in. He had never appeared on a national election ticket, yet he stood a single heartbeat away from the presidency. From that point forward, his life changed overnight. He moved from the collegiate atmosphere of the House to the heavy burdens of the executive branch. His new role was a political tightrope walk. He had to remain a loyal vice president to an administration increasingly besieged by the Watergate scandal, while maintaining the personal integrity that the country so desperately needed. He had been chosen to provide a steady hand for a vice presidency in crisis, but little could anyone predict the series of events already in motion that would soon vault Gerald Ford into the Oval Office itself. On the night of June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested in the shadows of the Watergate complex, Washington, D.C. At first, it was dismissed as a third-rate burglary, but as investigations pulled on the threads, the fabric of the Nixon presidency began to unravel. What followed was a 2-year descent into a constitutional abyss. Subpoenas, secret tapes, and late-night resignations painted a picture of an imperial presidency that had lost its moral compass. In the streets, public confidence evaporated. In Washington, the air was thick with the scent of a terminal crisis. As the walls closed in on Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford stood in the eye of the storm. He was the ultimate contrast to the moment, a man of open doors and plain speech, in an era defined by closed rooms and deep throats. He had accepted the vice presidency as a quiet capstone to a long career, a final act of service before retirement. Instead, he was witnessing the collapse of the very institutions he had spent 25 years defending. By mid-1974, the weight of the evidence left no room for retreat. On August 9, 1974, for the first time in 2 centuries of American history, a president resigned amid allegations of criminal activity. The nation was exhausted, cynical, and leaderless. Minutes later, in the East Room, the accidental president stepped forward. Gerald Ford took the oath of office, not with the fanfare of an election victory, but with the solemn resolve of a man stepping into a wreckage. He acknowledged the staggering weight of the moment. He was the first man to hold the highest office in the land without a single vote cast in his name. In his first address, he didn't offer soaring rhetoric or political attacks. He offered the only thing he knew, the truth. He famously told a grieving nation, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works." Through the machinery of the 25th Amendment and the tragedy of resignation, the presidency had changed hands. Gerald Ford now stood at the center of the world stage, convincing a skeptical people that their government could be honest once again. Just weeks after taking office, Gerald Ford faced a decision that would define the early course of his presidency. The investigations surrounding Watergate were still active. Legal proceedings were ongoing. Subpoenas and inquiries continued to move through the courts and Congress. Richard Nixon, though no longer in office, remained a central figure in unresolved matters that still carried national attention. Inside the White House, Ford confronted the question of how to proceed. On September 8, 1974, he issued a proclamation granting Richard Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any offenses that he may have committed during his presidency. The decision immediately halted any potential federal prosecution. Nixon would begin to withdraw from public life. The legal chapter tied to his presidency came to a close. For Ford, the consequences began at once. The press began to speculate that a corrupt bargain had been struck between the two men. Some commentators framed the pardon as part of a broader political pattern of scandal that already eroded public trust in Washington. Critics saw something different. To them, the pardon appeared to place a former president beyond accountability, without trial and without formal legal resolution. In Congress and across the country, reaction was intense. Public trust in Ford's new presidency declined sharply in the weeks that followed. The decision became a central issue during Ford's presidency, shaping public perception and contributing to declining support. It remained a point of contention throughout his time in office and into the 1976 election. Ford, though, stood by his decision. He later stated that he would not let public polling stop him from doing what was right. He made the decision, carried it out, and accepted the consequences that followed. In the final days of the Vietnam War, as Saigon collapsed and evacuation flights carried thousands out of the city, a second crisis began to take shape. Beyond the military withdrawal, there was those who had no place on those final helicopters, civilians without American connections, families separated in the chaos, and children without documentation or guardians. Refugee camps began to fill across the region. Inside the United States, the question shifted quickly from evacuation to resettlement. How to receive, process, and relocate those who had been forced to leave everything behind. In 1975, as Congress rejected additional military and economic aid to the South, Gerald Ford moved forward with emergency executive funding to begin a large-scale refugee evacuation and resettlement effort, while broader support measures moved through Congress. At the same time, a more immediate effort took form. Among those still in South Vietnam were those thousands of children, some orphaned during the war, some orphaned after the war, others separated in its final days, many without clear documentation or confirmed family status as the evacuation accelerated. There was a tangible fear their lives would be in peril as North Vietnamese forces closed in on Saigon. Flights were organized to remove them from the country. The operation became known as Operation Baby Lift. Ford moved quickly to authorize the program, using emergency executive funds on April 3, 1975. Personally, pushing through bureaucratic red tape between the State Department and military logistics to immediately get the program off the ground. Ford recalled, "I ordered American officials in Saigon to cut through any red tape that might stand in the way of the children's escape. Then I told Air Force to begin those mercy flights as soon as possible. Everyone suffers in a war, but no one suffers more than children, and the airlift was the least that we could do." Aircraft were assembled, and children were brought to the airfields for transport out of Saigon. The process moved quickly. often under incomplete conditions as officials worked within narrowing time constraints. On April 4, 1975, the first major flight departed. Shortly after takeoff, the aircraft experienced a critical failure and crashed outside of Saigon. 78 children were among those killed. The crash drew immediate shock from those involved in the operation. In the aftermath, questions were raised about the pace and conditions under which the evacuations were being carried out. Despite the loss, the operation continued. In the days that followed, the flights resumed. Additional aircraft departed, carrying children out of Vietnam to the United States and other countries. Upon their arrival, they were received by medical teams, government personnel, and adoption agencies prepared to place them with families. Days later, a chartered jet carrying 325 children touched down in San Francisco during a rainstorm. The president was there to meet them. He didn't just stand on the podium, he walked onto a crowded aircraft. He reached out his arms and physically carried the terrified, exhausted children to safety, even staying to help bottle feed the smallest arrivals. The broader refugee effort continued alongside it, processing families, relocating individuals, and coordinating support across multiple states. By the time the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act was passed, Ford had successfully moved over 130,000 refugees to safety. It was more than a resettlement effort. It was an act of national atonement, marking an end of a long, dark war with a single bright light of compassion. The war in Vietnam had entered its final phase. In Washington, President Gerald Ford faced a rapidly collapsing situation. North Vietnamese forces were advancing southward at a pace that outstripped earlier intelligence estimates, breaking through defensive lines and closing in on Saigon. Ford already appealed to Congress for additional military aid to stabilize the South, but the request was denied. Without new funding, and with American combat forces long since withdrawn, he was out of options. It was no longer a matter of how to preserve South Vietnam, but how to manage its surrender. Without support, the South Vietnamese forces collapsed, leaving no resistance to the North Vietnamese takeover of the South. Inside Saigon, that reality became visible. Evacuation planning, long considered a contingency, shifted into execution. Under Ford's authorization, American personnel began coordinating a phased withdrawal, prioritizing U.S. citizens while attempting to include as many at-risk South Vietnamese as possible. As conditions deteriorated, the evacuation accelerated into what would become Operation Frequent Wind. Helicopters cycled in and out of the city in rapid succession, from rooftops, courtyards, and improvised landing zones. The aircraft now represented the only lifeline out of a country in full collapse. Each landing carried more uncertainty, each departure marked by the shrinking space and diminishing time. The North Vietnamese were closing in on the embassy with every minute that ticked by, determined not only to take control, but to exact revenge on those who had aided the United States and South Vietnam during the war. Back in Washington, Ford and his advisors monitored the operation in real time. The objective was no longer orderly withdrawal, but speed. Moving as many people as possible before North Vietnamese forces reached the city center. As pressure on Saigon intensified, the evacuation system began to strain under its own scale. Aircraft arrived and departed under severe time constraints, with limited capacity and growing crowds overwhelming extraction points. Ford authorized the transition to a full helicopter evacuation when fixed-wing operations became untenable. It was a decisive shift, one that acknowledged the imminent fall of the city. As the final perimeter tightened, the situation reached a breaking point. Not everyone was able to leave. The decision to end the evacuation immediately fell to Gerald Ford. It was a necessary judgment made under severe constraints, one that left people behind, but one that, if delayed, risked even greater loss of life. Across Saigon, thousands were left behind as evacuation opportunities disappeared. Some were separated in the chaos. Others never reached the extraction points before the windows closed. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon. The city was lost, and all evacuation operations came to an end. The images of the final helicopter off the embassy roof became the lasting image of the conflict across the world. What had begun as a controlled withdrawal ended in collapse, closing a decades-long conflict and marking the end of American presence in Vietnam. In 1975, the geopolitical landscape was in transition. As American involvement in Vietnam came to a close, the Cold War entered a new phase of tension involving the Soviet Union and China. Ford chose to maintain the established policy of détente, a strategy aimed at easing military tensions between the superpowers while preserving the Western position. This approach focused on the negotiation and arms limitation rather than the direct confrontation, operating on the belief that managing this Cold War was preferable to a hot one. Ford traveled to Finland to join 35 world leaders in signing the Helsinki Accords. The agreement was immediately controversial. Critics at home, and even within the administration, argued that it effectively codified Soviet control over Eastern Europe by recognizing post-war borders. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger initially dismissed it as a diplomatic gesture to European allies. Ford, however, emphasized the importance of the agreement's third basket, which committed all the signees to respect fundamental human rights and the freer flow of information. Responding to domestic pressure, Ford stated, "If it all fails, Europe will be no worse off than it is now. If even a part of it succeeds, the cause of freedom will advance at least that far." Over the long term, these human rights provisions provided a framework for dissident groups in the Soviet bloc, such as the Helsinki Watch, to monitor government compliance. What began as a disputed diplomatic agreement eventually became a tool for internal political pressure within the Iron Curtain. Ford's foreign policy was also defined by the use of military force. In May 1975, just weeks after the fall of Saigon, Khmer Rouge forces seized an American cargo ship, the SS Mayaguez, in the Gulf of Thailand. Determined to prevent a prolonged hostage situation, Ford authorized a marine assault on the island of Koh Tang. The operation was fraught with logistical challenges and intelligence failures. Marines encountered heavy resistance on an island where the crew was not being held. By the time the operation concluded, the crew had been released separately by the Khmer Rouge. However, 41 U.S. service members died during the rescue attempt. Their names are the final entries on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., marking the conclusion of U.S. combat involvement in the region. The final test of Ford's military response occurred in the summer of 1976. In the Korean Demilitarized Zone, North Korean soldiers killed 2 American officers who were attempting to trim a popular tree that obstructed a vital line of sight. The incident brought the region to the brink of a renewed conflict. Ford's response was a high-visibility show of force known as Operation Paul Bunyan. While B-52 bombers and heavy artillery were placed on standby, a large convoy of U.S. and South Korean troops entered the DMZ to complete the task. They did not engage in combat. They cut the tree down to a stump. The display led to a rare expression of regret from the North Korean leadership and restored the status quo without further escalation. The summer of 1976 arrived like a long-awaited exhale. After years of fracture, the bicentennial wasn't just a birthday. It was a desperate search for a pulse. Across the heartland, the Freedom Train cut through the morning mist, a reminder that despite the stormy waters of the past decade, the American machinery was still turning. It carried the weight of history in its cars, but for the crowds lining the tracks, it carried something rarer, a sense of quiet hope. On the grounds of Monticello, standing in the shadow of Jefferson's legacy, Gerald Ford looked out at the sea of new faces. These weren't just spectators. They were immigrants taking the oath of citizenship. In that moment, Ford wasn't just a politician. He was the nation's host, welcoming the new threads into the fabric that had been so nearly torn apart. Even as the fireworks faded, the shadows from the Oval Office loomed. The campaign trail wasn't a victory lap, it was a battlefield. For the first time in modern history, a sitting U.S. president was fighting for his life within his own party. In Kansas City, the air was thick with the scent of political insurgency. On one side stood Ford, the steady, weathered pragmatist. On the other, Ronald Reagan, the charismatic firebrand who promised a different kind of morning in America. Then came the man from Plains. Jimmy Carter didn't run on white papers or policy wonkery. He ran on the idea of a soul. A DC outsider, he spoke of honesty and healing to a public that had forgotten what those sounded like coming from a podium. The race that followed was a rare moment of grace in American politics. It was a contest of character. They were 2 men who fundamentally respected the weight of a chair that they sought. Even when Ford stumbled, a momentary lapse in a debate about the Iron Curtain that would haunt his polling, the tone remained civil. As the sun rose on November 3rd, the verdict was in. The nation had chosen a fresh start over a steady hand. The true measure of the man came in defeat. On the inaugural stage, Jimmy Carter did something extraordinary. Before he began his own story, he turned to the man he had just unseated and thanked him for healing our land. Gerald Ford had helped the nation weather the storm, much as he had years earlier aboard the USS Monterey. He took hold of a country in a moment of fracture and helped steady it again until it could stand. History has often reduced the Ford presidency to a footnote. His quiet dedication to the office would be felt long after he left it. In the quiet decades after he left the White House, the air around Gerald Ford began to change. The anger that had once trailed him like a shadow, born from the stroke of a pen and a pardon of Richard Nixon, started to soften. The world began to see what Ford had seen all along, that you cannot heal a wound if you keep pulling at the stitches. In 2001, when he was awarded the JFK Profile and Courage Award, the nation finally admitted what it had been too hurt to say in 1974, that he had sacrificed his own political future to save the country. Ford's leadership wasn't a roar, it was a steady beat. He had taken the oath of office in a house that was on fire, inheriting a crisis of confidence that felt terminal. He left it having proved that the institution was stronger than any one man, because of one man. On the day after Christmas 2006, Gerald Ford passed away at the age of 93. For a moment, the modern world slowed down. The ceremonies moved with a heavy grace from the marble halls of Washington to the snow-dusted streets of Grand Rapids. Under the great rotunda, he lay in repose, a final watch in the chambers where he had spent 25 years as a man of the house. In the front row seat, Jimmy Carter, the man who had unseated him, but who had become his dearest friend in the years that followed. Carter stood, and with a voice thick with emotion, repeated the words he had first spoken 30 years prior. For myself, and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he did to heal our land. Tributes that week didn't talk about policy or polling. They talked about things that felt almost antique: decency, humility, duty. In the end, Ford's legacy wasn't one of transformation, it was one of restoration. He didn't try to reinvent the presidency, he just tried to make it honest again. When the nation had lost its way, he offered the only thing that could lead it home: steadiness. And in doing so, he ensured that the office he held could endure, not just through the storm, but for all the years that followed.
I once asked you for your prayers, and now I give you mine. May God guide this wonderful country, its people, and those they have chosen to lead them. May our third century be illuminated by liberty and blessed with brotherhood, so that we, in all who come after us, may be the humble servants of thy peace. Amen. Good night. God bless you.